You don't live there anymore. You should think about somewhere more suitable. Like a nursing home. Each word fell like a hammer blow. Margaret tried to steady herself, tears brimming but defiant still. But it's the house I paid off, the place you grew up, the place where you once called me, the heart of your life. Daniel turned away, avoiding her gaze. The crease in his brow was not worry, but annoyance. His voice came, flat and cutting like a blade. You're old. You're a burden. We've made our decision. Her chest tightened, her body swayed under the weight of his words. Before she could gather herself, Melissa stepped closer, eyes cold, and gave a slight push to her shoulder. It was not forceful, yet enough to topple her fragile body, still healing from injury, sending her crashing onto the rough concrete. The sound of impact echoed, her papers scattering across the ground, her cane rolling away. She lay there, palms scraped raw, eyes lifted toward her only son, the boy she once cradled through nights of wheezing asthma, the child who had laughed freely as she steadied the handlebars of his first bicycle. But now, Daniel only stood there. He did not move toward her. He did not offer a hand. His face was shut tight, his eyes averted, leaving his mother sprawled in pain before him. In that moment, Margaret grasped a brutal truth. The bond of motherhood was no longer a lifeline. This was the peak of betrayal, and the beginning of her resolve that she would never bow her head again. In the narrow rented room, its walls stained and damp with mildew, Margaret sat silently on the edge of the bed. The dim yellow light fell on the worn folder she held in her hands, its leather cover frayed, its papers yellowed by time. Each sheet she unfolded was like a doorway opening into the past, a life marked by loss, but carried with a resilience no one could have imagined. At the center of the bundle lay her nursing license, the name of her younger self still etched clearly across the page. It pulled her back to those years drenched in sweat inside the hospital walls, scrubbing blood from the tiles, wrapping wounds, holding the hands of patients as they breathed their last. It was the job she took on to raise Daniel, in her early 30s, newly widowed after a scaffolding collapse stole her husband's life. They handed her only his wedding ring in a cold plastic bag, and from that day, she knew the weight of the world rested on her shoulders alone. The difficult years stretched endlessly. There were nights when she counted the last few coins, rationing canned beans and packets of noodles so Daniel could have a new pair of shoes for school. She worked graveyard shifts without sleep, sewing in stolen moments, patching winter coats together from scraps of fabric. Even when her fingers stiffened from the cold and the ache of arthritis, she planted roses along the front path of their little house, whispering a promise to herself, "This will be a home, a safe haven for my son." That house was never just bricks and shingles. It was the living proof of every tear swallowed, every callus earned, every ache of loneliness endured. Every stroke of paint on the walls, every creak of the wooden floor testified to her unrelenting effort. On Daniel's graduation day, the photograph of mother and son on the front porch still remained in the folder, his eyes brimming with pride, his arms tight around her shoulders, whispering, "You're my heart, the reason I stand here today." But now, sitting alone in the cold room, staring at a picture of the boy whose chin had once been smeared with chocolate, Margaret was struck by a bitter truth. All of those sacrifices had been erased with nothing more than a new lock, a single ruthless denial. The house she had built with the entirety of her youth had been stolen, and with it, the sanctity of a motherhood she had once treasured more than life itself. In that moment, her tears fell onto the deed of ownership, not for the paper itself, but because she knew it was her love, poured unconditionally into her son, that had been betrayed most of all. Amid the bundle of yellowed papers, Margaret's trembling hand stopped at a sheet thicker than the rest, its red seal still clearly stamped. She pulled it free, her eyes widening, the deed of ownership. Her name, Margaret Langley, stood boldly across the page, the ink unfaded. There was no record of transfer, no signature but her own from years ago. That house, in the eyes of the law, had never left her possession. In that instant, a rush of heat surged through her chest, sweeping away the weight of humiliation and despair. For so long, she had believed herself nothing more than a shadow, an aging figure her son had cast aside. But this paper reminded her, she was not invisible. The house was still hers, not because of memories, but because the law bore witness. She closed the folder and clutched it to her chest, as if holding onto a final spark of light. The pain of betrayal began to shift into resolve. For the first time in weeks, she straightened her back, her gaze firm upon the emptiness ahead. If my son seeks to erase me with words, then I will prove myself with truth. A name rose in her mind, Kelsey Tranesk, the young legal intern she had once known at the hospital years ago. Kelsey had often brought her tea during long night shifts, a kindness Margaret never forgot. Now, Kelsey was no longer an intern but a practicing attorney with her own office. Without hesitation, Margaret powered up her old laptop, pressing each heavy key until the subject line appeared, urgent, property ownership. An hour later, the phone rang. Kelsey's voice came through, steady and warm. No panic, no pity. Ms. Langley, I've heard. Bring the documents to my office. We'll take care of this. In that moment, Margaret felt strength flow back into her veins. For the first time since the fall in her bathroom, since the cruel words of her only son, she no longer felt cast out. She had found irrefutable proof, and with it, a new conviction. She could rise again, not just for the house, but for the dignity that was always hers. Welcome to True Stories. Today, I'm going to share with you a story that has brought many people to tears and left them in deep reflection. A mother, after being discharged from the hospital, returned to the house she had cherished for 35 years, only to discover that the locks had been changed. Even worse, her only son declared, "My mother passed away 3 weeks ago." This is not only a heartbreaking family tragedy, but also the powerful journey of a woman who rose from pain to awakening, to reclaim her dignity and her worth. If you want to hear the full story, and many more true stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Because every story here is not just meant to be heard, but to leave us with lessons that resonate deeply in our own lives. After 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from a fractured hip, Margaret returned home with the longing to touch every familiar corner of her house. To her, the house was not just a place to live, but the only refuge that had held decades of memories. Every wall, every door, every creak of the wooden floor was tied to the childhood and growing years of Daniel, her only son. Yet, the moment she stood at the door, something felt different. The shiny lock glistened under the midday sun, looking strange and cold. When she slid her key in, she tried to turn it gently, but it no longer fit. For a moment, she told herself it was just her hand still trembling after surgery. She tried again. The key slipped in this time, but still wouldn't turn. An unease began to creep in. She looked closer. The doorknob had been replaced. Memories rushed back. The old knob bore a small scratch, the mark left when Daniel, at 7 years old, had mischievously tried to carve his name into it with a key. That scratch was like a tiny monument, a reminder of his innocent childhood. Now it was gone, replaced by a smooth, polished surface devoid of feeling. The door that had once carried memories was now stripped bare of them. The strangeness grew heavier. The house she had cherished, scrimped, and saved to pay off, now regarded her like an uninvited guest. With just one new lock, the entire space that had once been warm and familiar had turned cold. And in that instant, she realized, it wasn't only her key that no longer worked, her place in the family had also been replaced. Standing before the locked door, Margaret clung to a fragile thread of hope. She told herself perhaps Daniel had changed the locks temporarily for repairs, or maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. With trembling hands, she fumbled through her old handbag for her phone. The screen lit up with a familiar name. Daniel, her beloved son. Just hearing his voice, she believed, would be enough to dissolve all confusion. The phone rang 3 times. Her heart raced with anticipation. Then came Daniel's voice, unmistakable, yet stripped of the warmth it once carried. She steadied her voice, forcing calm. "Daniel, it's me, your mother. The key won't work. I'm standing outside the house." A short silence followed, before his reply came, cold, detached, as if spoken by a stranger. "Who is this? My mother passed away 3 weeks ago." The words cut into her like a knife, sharp and merciless. Her knees weakened. This was the son she had raised with every drop of blood, every tear, every sacrifice, and now he denied her very existence. For a moment, she could no longer tell where reality ended and nightmare began. She whispered, her voice fragile, pleading. "Daniel, it's me. I was discharged from the hospital this morning." But instead of comfort, she heard a woman's voice in the background, sharp and commanding. "Hang up. Don't talk to her." And then, the hollow tone of disconnection. Beep, beep. The line went dead, severing the last thread of connection she thought she still had. Under the scorching afternoon sun, in front of the house once filled with laughter, Margaret stood frozen, phone still pressed to her ear, listening to nothing but emptiness. It was not just the rejection of a phone call. It was the denial of a mother's entire life. And in that moment, Margaret understood. She had been erased from her son's world, even while she was still breathing. After the cruel phone call ended, Margaret stood frozen before the cold iron gate. In her mind, memories of the past 3 weeks in the hospital came rushing back, vivid as if it were only yesterday. She remembered the day she fell in the bathroom, lying helpless on the icy tiles until a neighbor discovered her and called an ambulance. The nurses told her she was lucky, only a fractured hip, not life-threatening. They reassured her that she would recover, that she would be able to walk again within a month. She recalled the endless nights in that stark white hospital room, the harsh fluorescent lights casting a pale glow on the ceiling. The echo of doctors' footsteps in the corridor, the murmur of other patients, the acrid scent of disinfectant filling every breath. She lay there, waiting for the sound of familiar footsteps, longing for a word from her son, her daughter-in-law, or at the very least, a message reminding her she was not forgotten. But for 3 long weeks, the door opened only for nurses and doctors, never once for family. Every day, she soothed herself with excuses. Daniel must be busy with work. Maybe Melissa has her hands full with the baby. Perhaps they don't even know I'm here in the hospital. That fragile hope was her only medicine, carrying her through the cold, sleepless nights. She pictured the homecoming. Daniel rushing out to embrace her, Melissa preparing something warm on the stove, the family gathered as if no absence had ever existed. But now, standing before the house with its new lock, every illusion shattered. That house had once been filled with memories, the laughter of birthday parties, winter nights huddled around hot soup, flu seasons when she scrubbed every corner to protect her son, sleepless nights stitching costumes for Daniel's school festivals. The house had once been the beating heart of their family. Now, it shut itself against her, as though to drive out the very woman who had built it. And in that moment, Margaret faced a bitter truth. The bond of motherhood she had always believed eternal had been buried by her son's own hands. Perhaps the house was no longer a home at all, but a living monument to betrayal. Though her heart was weighed down with disappointment, Margaret still clung to a fragile hope. Perhaps Daniel had misunderstood, perhaps the cruel words over the phone were nothing more than confusion. She decided to seek him out at his workplace, believing that once they stood face to face, once he saw his mother, flesh and blood before him, he could not possibly turn away. She stood outside the tall office building, the midday sun beating down, her cane trembling in her hand. After 2 long hours of waiting, the glass doors slid open and Daniel appeared in a crisp suit, phone in hand, walking beside his wife, Melissa. They looked every bit the successful couple, smiles still lingering on their lips. But the moment Daniel's eyes met hers, that smile evaporated, replaced by a look of cold detachment, tinged with irritation. She stepped forward, forcing a smile, her voice soft. "Daniel, I just want to talk to you, only for a moment." His brow furrowed, his voice dry and sharp. "You can't just show up here like this. You're embarrassing me." Melissa cut in, her tone firm, laced with disdain. "That house is ours now." In the small office of Kelsey's law firm, sunlight streamed through the window, falling across a neat stack of papers on the desk. Margaret sat opposite her, her back straighter than usual. Though her hands still trembled, her eyes shone with newfound determination. Page by page, word by word, the documents were carefully reviewed. Kelsey explained clearly. Ownership of the house still belonged to Margaret, and anyone, even Daniel, who seized it without consent was breaking the law. First, they drafted the document to revoke all previous powers of attorney, terminating any legal control Daniel once held. Next came a formal letter of warning, sent directly to his workplace and residence, declaring that changing the locks and occupying the house were unlawful acts. Each line of text struck like a hammer blow against the wall of silence and submission Margaret had built around herself for so many years. But the point was not merely to reclaim the house. When the legal steps were complete, Kelsey asked gently. Do you want to move back and live there? Margaret shook her head, a faint but resolute smile crossing her lips. No. I will not return to a place stained by betrayal. But I want to prove one thing, it was never Daniel's. That house is my blood, my sweat. And I decide its fate. That very day, an official rental notice was posted. 3-bedroom home, quiet neighborhood, rose garden, preference for families who cherish and respect the value of a home. When Margaret signed her name on the document, it was not only as the rightful owner, but as a public declaration, I am no longer a victim. I am the one who decides. In the glow of the late afternoon sun shining through the office window, she caught sight of her reflection. An older woman who had endured loss and betrayal, but who now stood tall with strength and clarity. The red seals stamped upon the papers affirmed more than just her legal rights, they affirmed the rebirth of her dignity. On the day of the handover, Margaret carried with her a new set of keys. They jingled softly in her hand, the sound ringing out like confirmation, everything had changed. Waiting at the gate was Mr. Thompson, a silver-haired man, tall and lean, with gentle eyes. He was a retired high school principal, now living with his teenage grandson after the loss of his wife. From their very first phone call, Margaret had sensed his sincerity, respect, and gratitude. As she placed the keys into his hand, she spoke quietly. Please treat this as a home, not just a house. Mr. Thompson's eyes grew misty, his hand trembling as he clasped hers. Are you sure? This is a wonderful home, and clearly it holds so many memories. Margaret nodded softly, her smile tender but resolute. I'm sure. All that matters is that you cherish it, as I once did. In that moment, the burden she had carried for months seemed to lift. The house had found someone worthy, and she had affirmed her right to decide, no longer at the mercy of anyone else. A few days later, Daniel returned, dressed neatly, bearing the familiar confidence of a man convinced the world still revolved around him. But when he pressed his key into the lock, it wouldn't budge. He twisted harder, then knocked on the door as if by instinctive entitlement. And when the door finally opened, it wasn't the trembling face of his mother that greeted him, but the calm figure of Mr. Thompson. Daniel frowned, his tone curt. I've come to see my mother. This is my house. Mr. Thompson crossed his arms, his voice steady. Mrs. Margaret is the rightful owner. I am the lawful tenant. And you are, who, exactly? For a brief moment, Daniel froze, his lips pressed tight, his eyes flashing with both confusion and fury. For the first time in his life, he felt the sting of rejection at the threshold of what he had once called his own. No welcome, no entry, only a foreign door, a new lock, and the truth, the house had never belonged to him. Standing on the porch where he had once played as a child, Daniel now tasted the bitter feeling his mother had endured, to be shut out, to be treated as an outsider. The only difference was this time, it was the direct consequence of his own doing. Since the day Mr. Thompson moved in, Margaret's phone had not stopped vibrating. The first message arrived at dawn, just as the sun began to rise. On the screen were 2 simple words, I'm sorry, Mom. She stared at them for a long time, her trembling fingers hovering above the keyboard, but in the end, she set the phone down. She knew this was not an apology born of love, but of fear that the familiar door would never open to him again. In the days that followed, more messages came. Daniel wrote that it was Melissa's idea, that I only did what she asked, that we were struggling financially, I had no choice. But each line only steeled her further. Because during those 3 weeks she lay in the hospital, he never once came. When she was shoved to the ground outside his office, not a single hand reached out to help. And now, excuses surfaced only after he had lost the privileges he had once taken for granted. Margaret chose silence, not out of hatred, but because silence was the clearest answer of all. She was no longer the woman who would reach out, begging for her son's affection. She had learned to stand on her own, no longer needing his recognition. Then came the day Daniel appeared at the door of her small apartment. The arrogance was gone. He sat slumped in the chair, his voice hoarse. I didn't know it would come to this. I was just afraid. She did not interrupt, did not scold. Instead, she quietly stepped into the other room and returned with a neat folder, the signed rental contract with Mr. Thompson. Placing it in front of him, She spoke softly but firmly. That house has a new tenant. You no longer have any claim to it. Daniel's face drained of color as he stared at the paper. Margaret held his gaze and delivered her final words. Once, I was your home, the place you returned to. But now, I am only the landlord. And the landlord has locked the door. It was not revenge, but release. Not just for her, but for the relationship that had long since died. She was no longer bound by the past, no longer waiting for a love that had withered away. Through silence and decisive choice, Margaret reclaimed her right to live for herself. In her small but cozy apartment, Margaret spread a blue tablecloth patterned with sunflowers, carefully laying out each old but spotless plate. There was no special occasion, only an evening when she wished to share her space. 6 women arrived, carrying steaming dishes and hearts that bore their own scars. They, too, had been pushed aside by children, by families, by society, dismissed as burdens. The room quickly filled with the scent of freshly baked bread, roasted vegetables, and the mingling sounds of laughter and tears. They told one another stories that had always been silenced before, stories once deemed too much. For the first time, no one had to hold back, no one had to wait for permission to be heard. Margaret sat among them, listening, smiling, raising her glass in unison. In that moment, she realized a profound truth: she had never been alone. Countless women had walked, and were still walking, the same path of being forgotten, denied, yet carrying the weight of the world with quiet strength, enduring and surviving. As night deepened, she poured tea into her old kettle, its familiar whistle rising like a hymn of comfort. Lifting her cup, she spoke softly but with conviction. We are not invisible. We are not merely the silent walls that hold everything up. We have the right to keep our worth, the right to speak, the right to choose ourselves. Her words did not thunder like a manifesto, but they shone in the eyes of those around her, a quiet, enduring power that transcended the wounds of the past. The story did not close with hatred or vengeance, but with rebirth. Margaret was no longer the erased mother, no longer the trembling woman before a locked door. She was the master of her own life, living proof that sometimes the deepest revenge is not to reclaim or to conquer, but to live in peace, in freedom, and in the unwavering choice of oneself. Thank you for watching True Stories. Every story we share is a reminder that behind closed doors are struggles, strength, and lessons worth remembering. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to ring the bell so you won't miss the next story. Until then, take care of yourself, and remember, sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths.